What happens when the very people who arrive to demolish a house of worship end up kneeling inside it? This isn't some ancient fable or feel-good movie plot. This occurred in modern-day Busan, South Korea, where an angry mob of thousands gathered to demand the destruction of a mosque, only to leave as transformed individuals. At the center stood Kang Ji-hun, a hardened former Marine who had vowed never to step foot in a Muslim place of prayer. Yet by day's end, this same man found himself prostrate on the mosque's carpet, tears streaming down his face. Here's how hatred turned to humility in a single afternoon. Rain fell softly on that fateful Friday morning as Imam Yu Song-min prepared his khutbah inside Busan's Al-Noor Mosque. The quiet patter against the windows contrasted sharply with the storm about to break outside. By 8 a.m., the streets surrounding the mosque, normally peaceful at this hour, had become a sea of angry faces and raised banners. "No Islam in Korea," one sign screamed. "Protect our culture," declared another. At the vanguard stood Kang Ji-hun, his military short hair soaked from the drizzle, his voice hoarse from leading chants through a megaphone. Police scrambled to form barriers as news crews jostled for position. Inside the mosque, rather than barricading the doors as expected, the worshippers made a decision that would change everything. They invited the protesters in. The turning point. The tension reached its peak when a rock came flying from the crowd, shattering a stained glass window. In the stunned silence that followed, a bearded worshipper named Ahmed stepped outside, not with clenched fists but with open hands. "Why destroy when you can understand?" he asked calmly. Kang Ji-hun scoffed at this apparent weakness, but his certainty wavered when the adhan suddenly pierced the air. The hauntingly beautiful call to prayer seemed to stop time itself. Han Ji-yun, a college student who had joined the protest reluctantly, felt her breath catch. "It's like my soul recognized that sound," she would later say. The revelation. As about 24 protesters hesitantly entered, they encountered scenes that shattered their preconceptions. Korean grandmothers in hijabs leading children by the hand, young men in business suits praying beside construction workers, Imam Song-min speaking about charity and community service. When the time came for Salah, the protesters watched in silence as rows of worshippers moved in perfect unison, their foreheads touching the ground in humility. This wasn't the violent extremism we'd been warned about, Han Ji-yun realized aloud. Her quiet observations sparked murmurs of agreement through the group. Then, in a moment that would be replayed on news channels across Asia, a burly factory worker from the protest line stepped forward and asked Imam Song-min how to become Muslim. The aftermath. Within weeks, the story became a national phenomenon. News outlets scrambled to cover what commentators were calling the miracle in Busan. 200 former protesters, people who had arrived shouting slogans of hate, had taken their shahada, embracing Islam in a wave of spiritual awakening. Among them was Han Ji-yun, whose tearful testimony on national television, "I came to protest, but I found peace," went viral, viewed millions of times across social media. Kang Ji-hun, once the face of the anti-mosque movement, found himself haunted by what he had witnessed. Night after night he returned to the mosque, sitting silently in the back, observing prayers, listening to discussions. His military-trained mind, used to assessing threats, now wrestled with an uncomfortable truth. Everything he had believed about Islam was wrong. The final blow to his prejudice came not from sermons or debates, but from action. One evening, as he lingered outside the mosque, he noticed a group of volunteers loading boxes into a van. Curious, he approached, only to discover it was the mosque's free meal program for Busan's homeless. What stunned him most was that the organizers weren't foreign immigrants, but Korean converts, people just like him. One of them, a former protester named Park Min-ho, recognized Kang and handed him a container of food. "You hungry?" he asked casually, as if they hadn't once stood on opposite sides of a police barricade. That simple act of kindness shattered Kang's remaining resistance. Later that night, in a quiet conversation with Imam Song-min, he finally admitted, "I came here hating what I thought Islam stood for, but you've shown me what it actually is." When Kang publicly took his shahada the following week, the reaction was explosive. His conversion made front-page headlines, with conservative outlets accusing him of betraying Korea, while progressive ones hailed it as a triumph of truth over fear. Talk shows debated whether this was a genuine spiritual awakening or mass manipulation, and sociologists scrambled to analyze the phenomenon. But the real impact was on the streets. In Seoul, Daegu, and even smaller cities, curious Koreans began visiting mosques. Not to protest, but to learn. Some came out unchanged. Others left with copies of the Quran in hand. A few even stayed for the next prayer. The Busan Mosque, once a lightning rod for controversy, became an unlikely symbol of hope. Its doors remained open, not just for worshippers, but for anyone seeking answers. And as the weeks passed, a quiet realization spread. The protest that was meant to erase Islam from Korea had instead made it stronger. This extraordinary incident held up a mirror to modern society, reflecting several uncomfortable truths we often choose to ignore. The protesters' initial rage, as investigations later revealed, wasn't born from any genuine interaction with Muslims, but from a toxic cocktail of sensationalized media narratives and politically motivated fear campaigns. News analysis showed how certain networks had consistently portrayed Islam through a lens of terrorism and cultural threat, while politicians had weaponized religious differences for electoral gain. The protesters' dramatic transformation became a living case study in prejudice reduction. Psychologists noted how their shift followed the contact hypothesis, the proven phenomenon that direct positive interaction between groups can break down even the most entrenched biases. What made this case remarkable was the speed and scale of change, proving that when people are confronted with reality rather than stereotypes, their worldviews can transform overnight. For South Korea, traditionally seen as a homogeneous society, the events forced a national reckoning about identity in an era of globalization. The sight of Korean Muslims leading prayers in fluent Hangul challenged the deep-seated notion that Korean-ness was tied to any single religion. Academics began re-examining Korea's long history of religious diversity, while young people started questioning why their education system had never mentioned the 150,000 Korean Muslims already living among them. Perhaps the most profound lesson came from the mosque itself. By choosing to open its doors rather than barricade them, the Muslim community demonstrated how places of worship can serve as unexpected peace builders in polarized societies. Urban planners noted how the mosque's architecture, with its transparent glass facade and open courtyard, physically embodied the values of transparency and welcome. Interfaith leaders worldwide began studying the Busan model of using sacred spaces as platforms for dialogue rather than division. The implications extended far beyond religion. Corporations noticed how the mosque's free meal program, staffed by former protesters and Muslims working side by side, created bonds that no diversity training could replicate. Educators saw how the protesters' journey from hatred to understanding offered a blueprint for combating all forms of extremism. And mental health professionals observed how the act of communal prayer provided something many protesters had been missing: a sense of belonging that no amount of nationalist rhetoric could fulfill. As the movement grew, it faced fierce institutional resistance. The mayor who had initially approved the mosque construction found himself facing recall efforts. Textbook publishers came under pressure to omit the events from school curricula. Most painfully, some converts like Kang Ji-hun found themselves ostracized from their own families, with parents claiming they had lost their children to foreigners. Yet in a stunning reversal, public opinion began shifting when investigative journalists exposed how certain anti-mosque groups had received funding from extremist organizations abroad. The very nationalists who had accused Muslims of being foreign agents were revealed to be taking orders from overseas hate groups. This revelation sparked a wave of patriotic backlash, with many Koreans now seeing the mosque defenders as the true protectors of Korean values: tolerance, honesty, and independence. The movement's most unexpected leaders emerged from the converts themselves. Han Ji-yoon, using her background in social media, launched a viral Ask a Korean Muslim campaign that reached millions. Former protest leader Kang Ji-hun became a sought-after speaker at military bases, using his Marine credentials to reach skeptical audiences. Their message was simple but revolutionary. You don't have to choose between your faith and your homeland. The truest patriotism is building a society where everyone belongs. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time, consider this. The protesters came to the mosque that day armed with signs and slogans, but the most powerful weapon turned out to be something far simpler: an open door. In a world that keeps building walls, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is take one down.